Before the smoke cleared, before the casualty lists were typed, there was the sound, the ripping snarl of automatic fire tearing through trees, the rising scream of engines diving out of the clouds, boots scrambling in mud as men threw themselves flat, praying the earth would swallow them whole. World War II was not just fought with bullets and steel, but with something far less visible: fear. Official reports would later describe these weapons in sterile language: effective deployment, successful suppression, tactical advantage. But survivors told a different story. They spoke of nerves shattered, of units frozen in place, of panic spreading faster than shrapnel. Some weapons didn't simply kill, they broke morale before they broke bodies. And the final weapon on this list didn't just terrify soldiers, it changed how war itself was fought. But panic on the battlefield rarely began with explosions. Sometimes it started with a single, unmistakable sound. The MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw. The unmistakable sound many Allied soldiers never forgot was the MG-42, firing at over 1,200 rounds per minute. It didn't crack like a rifle or hammer like earlier machine guns. It roared, a mechanical scream so fast it blended into a single, ripping note. German engineers designed it for efficiency: stamped parts, quick-change barrels, ruthless reliability. On paper, it was a tool for area suppression, meant to pin advancing infantry and control territory. In reality, it became something else entirely. American and British troops described it as tearing the air apart, a weapon that seemed less like gunfire and more like fabric being violently ripped open. Men hit the dirt instantly, not because they saw the gunner, but because they heard it. The sound alone dictated movement, trapping entire units behind cover. Momentum shattered. If the MG-42 froze men in place, the next weapon forced them to run, often too late. The Katyusha rocket launcher, Stalin's organ. If the MG-42 was a snarl at ground level, the Soviet Katyusha was a scream from the sky. When its rockets launched, they didn't whistle, they howled. A rising, shrieking chorus that earned it the nickname Stalin's organ. Technically, it was imprecise. The rockets scattered, accuracy sacrificed for volume. But precision was never the point. Entire salvos could saturate a wide area in seconds, turning forests, trenches, and staging zones into chaos. German soldiers wrote about units breaking formation before the first explosions even landed. The sound alone signaled annihilation was seconds away. This was shock and awe before the phrase existed, a weapon that overwhelmed the senses and shattered cohesion. There was no clear target to eliminate, no single gun to silence, just incoming terror, unpredictable and indiscriminate. Stay with me, because the next weapon didn't rely on noise at all. Sometimes the deadliest fear wasn't loud. It was silent and waiting beneath your feet. The Stuka dive bomber, the Jericho trumpet. Before the bombs even fell, the terror arrived first. As the German Ju-87 Stuka angled downward into its dive, a wind-driven siren mounted to its landing gear began to wail. The sound was deliberate, a mechanical shriek designed not for accuracy, but for intimidation. Civilians on the ground described it as paralyzing, a descending scream that seemed to pull the sky down with it. Soldiers in Poland and France during the early Blitzkrieg learned to recognize that howl as the prelude to devastation. The Stuka's early war dominance amplified the effect. Wherever it appeared, collapse often followed. Entire defensive lines fractured under the psychological weight of that sound. Yet as enemy air power improved, the Stuka became vulnerable, eventually phased out of frontline prominence. Still, its siren had already done its work, carving fear into memory. As terrifying as bombs from above were, something far smaller could create even deeper panic. The flamethrower, fire as a weapon. In the tight suffocation of bunkers and trench lines, the flamethrower turned combat into something ancient and visceral. There was no distant artillery arc, no invisible sniper round, just a burst of liquid fire flooding confined space, devouring oxygen and hope in seconds. Courage, training, doctrine, none of it fully prepared a man for flame crawling toward him. Fire bypassed strategy and struck at instinct. Though not banned outright during the war, its use carried an unspoken stigma, a tension between battlefield necessity and moral discomfort. Soldiers facing it often abandoned fortified positions immediately, choosing exposure over incineration. It was not merely lethal, it was psychologically unbearable, leaving survivors scarred long after burns healed. Entire strongpoints collapsed without prolonged firefights, fear doing half the work. And what comes next wasn't just terrifying, it was controversial even among those who used it. If fire attacked the senses, the next weapon attacked morality itself. The Panzerfaust, the tank killer in every hand. By the final years of the war, Germany no longer had the luxury of abundance. What it had was urgency. The Panzerfaust was the answer. A crude, single-shot anti-tank launcher that was cheap to produce and simple enough for barely trained Volkssturm recruits to operate. Officially, it was a defensive tool. In reality, it transformed every alleyway, every shattered window, into a potential execution point for armored crews. For years, tanks had symbolized dominance, steel behemoths that crushed resistance beneath their tracks. The Panzerfaust shattered that illusion. One hidden soldier could cripple a vehicle worth exponentially more, turning urban combat into a claustrophobic nightmare. Allied tankers began scanning rooftops and rubble with equal suspicion, nerves fraying with every narrow street. It was a weapon born of desperation, but its psychological impact was undeniable. But by 1944, panic wasn't just on the battlefield, it was underwater. The German U-boat wolf packs. Far from the front lines, another kind of panic unfolded in the black waters of the Atlantic. German U-boats operated in coordinated wolf packs, a doctrine built on patience and precision. Submarines would shadow Allied convoys silently, transmitting positions until the pack assembled. Then, often under cover of darkness, they struck. For merchant sailors, there were no trenches to dive into, no trees for cover, only freezing ocean. One moment the sea was calm. The next, a torpedo tore through steel, and a ship erupted into fire. Survivors spoke of the terror of waiting, scanning empty horizons, knowing something unseen was tracking them below. Supply lines became psychological battlegrounds, every crossing a gamble. The wolf packs didn't just sink ships. They imposed a constant grinding dread on those who kept the Allies supplied. And yet, even beneath the ocean's surface, there were limits. The next weapon erased those limits entirely. The V-1 flying bomb, the sound that meant you still had time. By 1944, Londoners had learned to listen. The V-1 flying bomb announced itself with a harsh, sputtering buzz as its pulse jet engine pushed it across the sky. Unlike a sudden explosion, this weapon gave warning, a droning approach that froze streets mid-step. People counted seconds without realizing they were counting. The true terror came when the engine stopped. That abrupt silence meant the bomb was descending, uncontrolled, toward wherever gravity chose. There were no sirens fast enough, no shelters guaranteed safe. It was one of the earliest cruise missiles, crude but revolutionary, designed to strike cities indiscriminately. Its accuracy was limited, but that unpredictability was part of the weapon. The V-1 didn't just destroy buildings, it weaponized suspense, turning ordinary moments into countdowns. But the final entry wasn't loud. It wasn't mechanical. And it didn't give anyone time. Because in August 1945, panic reached a scale the world had never imagined. The Japanese kamikaze weaponized desperation. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase where machines were no longer enough. Japan turned to something far more unsettling: the pilot himself. The kamikaze was not just an aircraft loaded with explosives. It was a human-guided missile. Naval crews could see them coming, diving through anti-aircraft fire, engines roaring, wings burning, and never pulling away. That was the Terror. Traditional doctrine assumed self-preservation. These pilots had none. Officially, it was framed as honorable sacrifice, devotion to emperor and nation. In reality, it introduced a new psychological strain for Allied sailors. Watching a man deliberately fly into your ship shattered assumptions about combat limits. Fatigue set in. Guns fired constantly. Sleep became rare. The battlefield shifted from technology to ideology, from defeating equipment to confronting belief. Desperation itself had become a weapon, one that thought, chose, and refused to turn back. The atomic bomb, panic beyond the battlefield. On August 6, 1945, there was no approaching engine to track, no siren to measure distance. A single bomb detonated above Hiroshima, and in one blinding flash, an entire city was erased. This was not suppression, not shock and awe, not even terror in the conventional sense. It was instantaneous annihilation. Buildings dissolved, shadows burned into walls. Tens of thousands vanished before they could process what was happening. The war ended days later, but something far larger had begun. The atomic bomb introduced a doctrine built not on battlefield victory, but on the threat of total extinction. Panic was no longer confined to soldiers in trenches or sailors at sea. It expanded to governments, to civilians, to the species itself. For the first time, humanity understood that war could end civilization. Battlefield fear had escalated into existential annihilation, and there was no returning to the world that existed before that flash. The atomic bomb. Panic beyond the battlefield. On August 6, 1945, there was no siren long enough, no engine drone to measure. A single bomb detonated above Hiroshima, and in one blinding instant, an entire city was transformed into fire and shadow. This was not suppression fire or psychological intimidation. It was absolute destruction, delivered in seconds. The shockwave flattened buildings, vaporized lives, and rewrote the boundaries of warfare. For the first time, panic was no longer confined to trenches, convoys, or cities under siege. It became global. The atomic bomb ended the war, but it also introduced a doctrine built on terror, peace maintained through the threat of annihilation. Soldiers were no longer the only ones living under its shadow. Humanity itself was. The battlefield had expanded to encompass the world. World War II was fought with steel, fire, and explosive force. But the weapons that made the enemy panic remind us of something deeper. Fear has always been the most powerful weapon of all. If you thought these were the most terrifying weapons of the war, wait until you see what didn't make the headlines. Subscribe now, because next we're breaking down the banned, improvised, and forgotten tools that commanders denied, but soldiers depended on to survive.